Every single dog in the village of Cwmhudlyn, 27 by official count, howled from dusk to dawn on the night of April 30th, 1978. Not the usual brief, agitated barking of animals, sensing a storm or a fox. This was continuous, low, mournful wails that rose and fell across the valley like a sound carried on wind from somewhere very far away. By morning, the two twins were gone. This is a story that, on paper, doesn't seem possible. No bodies, no suspects, no viable leads. Just two children who arrived out of nowhere speaking a language no one could identify, and then just as suddenly disappeared. Official records reduced the case to a missing persons file long since closed. But within the community, within families who've lived in that part of Wales for generations, the story of Ellie and Iwan lingers like an old wound, quiet but never fully healed. It took me years to piece together what you're about to hear. My name is Carries Ellen. I'm a former lecturer in child language development at Swansea University. I never intended to become involved in a case like this, but in 2013 I was given access to a series of tapes, recordings made by a school speech therapist named Miriam Hughes between January and April of 1978. What I heard on those tapes changed everything I believed about the boundaries of language, cognition, and something else I'm not entirely comfortable naming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first known sighting of the twins was on January 9, 1978. A snowstorm had blanketed much of South Wales, cutting off rural towns and paralyzing roads. Gareth Ellis, a sheep farmer, was driving his battered Land Rover back from visiting his brother in Brecon when he spotted two figures on the road near Lynbraith, just beyond the tree line. The sun was setting, light already failing. They were standing dead still. Gareth later told police, not shivering, no shoes, holding hands like they were posing for a picture. He thought they were mannequins at first, dumped by vandals. But when he stepped out of the car, they turned toward him. Both of them, same time, same motion, like mirrors. The children were a boy and a girl, around 8 or 9 years old by visual estimation, pale to the point of looking bloodless, with thin white, blonde hair that hung limp around their faces. They were dressed in identical long nightshirts, cotton and teak, looking no labels. Their feet were caked in frozen mud. Ellis took them to the nearest police outpost in Langadog, 20 miles north. The officer on duty, PC Rise Poog, logged the children as found minors, and noted that they were coherent, though silent. Poog later said the only words they spoke during intake were in a language he didn't recognize, guttural and musical at once, like something between humming and bird call. The children had no injuries, no signs of malnourishment. Their temperatures were normal, but when a nurse checked their pupils with a penlight, both their eyes, so dark they looked black, contracted at exactly the same rate and time. They were placed in temporary care under the supervision of the local council. But no missing persons report ever matched them. Their fingerprints and photographs yielded no leads. Local social worker Glynis Ford described the twins as gentle, polite, and unnerving in a way I couldn't explain. They never cried. They never played. They never stopped watching each other. And most disturbingly, they never spoke to anyone but each other. It was only when Ford brought them to Cwmhudlyn Primary School that the situation began to draw real attention. Cwmhudlyn isn't on most maps. It's a former mining village nestled in the lower folds of the Brecfa Forest, a place where community ties run deep and people don't tend to ask questions they don't want answers to. In 1978, the population hovered just above 400. Most families had lived there for generations. Outsiders were tolerated, not welcomed. The arrival of the twins, as one former resident told me, was like a draft under the door you didn't notice until the fire went out. The headmistress at the time, Mrs. Olwen Davies, was reluctant to admit the children but was persuaded by the council's request. They were placed in Year 3 with Ms. Miriam Hughes, a young teacher fresh out of Cardiff with a background in special education. Miriam's involvement would prove pivotal, not just because she worked closely with the twins, but because she kept meticulous records of their speech. The first week of class was tense. The twins did not interact with the other children. They refused to speak English or Welsh, the two languages of instruction. But they communicated constantly with each other, whispering, singing in tandem, sometimes without moving their lips. They sat side by side at all times, and if forced apart, both became distressed. Not tantrum-level upset, something quieter, more primal. I once moved Ellie to the other side of the room for a reading exercise. Miriam noted in her first weekly report. Iwan immediately began bleeding from the nose. It stopped the moment she was allowed to return. The twins drew obsessively, page after page of spirals, geometric sigils, eye-shaped forms. Many of these would later be identified by researchers, not from linguistic sources, but from pre-Christian burial sites across Wales and Cornwall. One symbol in particular recurred: two intersecting loops, like a sideways figure 8, flanked by crescent shapes and a downward arrow. None of the teachers could identify it, but one child, Sian Lloyd, claimed she saw the same symbol burned into the bark of a tree near the old mining trail a week later. I didn't go back there after that. she told me, decades later. Didn't even tell my parents, but I still see it sometimes. On glass. In steam. It just shows up. As word of the twins spread, so did unease. Livestock miscarriages increased that winter. A series of electrical malfunctions caused street lamps to flicker uncontrollably along the main road. The church bell rang twice at midnight on February 1st. Imbolc, the old pagan festival of light. Despite having no rope attached and no one inside the chapel, villagers began to whisper. The old tales came out of hiding, talk of changelings, of the fair ones who steal children in the night and leave behind perfect copies that look the same, but aren't. Most dismissed it as hysteria, but others remembered stories told in hushed tones by their grandmothers, about twins who could speak to trees, twins who could call animals with song, twins who disappeared at the turning of the season and were never found. On February 14th, a Valentine's Day event at the school turned chaotic when a student named Defied Price collapsed during a spelling game. Witnesses claimed the twins had been staring at him, eyes unblinking, moments before he fainted. When he came to, Defied had a nosebleed and no memory of what had happened. That night he wet the bed for the first time in years. He told his mother the twins spoke to him in a dream. They told me they were waiting, he said, waiting for the door to open again. After that, several parents withdrew their children from school. The twins were moved to a foster home on the edge of the village, under the care of retired nurse Gwenny Thomas. She agreed to take them in on the condition that they be kept together. Mrs. Thomas had no surviving children of her own. Her husband had died in a quarry accident years prior. She lived alone in a 2-story stone cottage known locally as Tie Draw, a building older than the village itself, with uneven floors and an overgrown garden. Her journals, discovered after her death in 1994, provided the most intimate glimpse into life with the twins. The first entry, dated February 16th, they do not sleep unless touching. They eat the same number of bites at the same time. They do not laugh. They do not dream, or at least they don't say. But the house of the house feels different, like it's listening. By late March, Gwenny reported odd behavior in her own dog, a sheepdog named Teg, who had been loyal and even-tempered his entire life. He began growling at corners of the house, refusing to enter the twins' bedroom. Once, she found him hiding in the root cellar, tail between his legs, shaking uncontrollably. She tried to ignore it, focused on the practical, the children's routines, their hygiene, their quiet rituals. But then came the flowers. It started with the daffodils. Gwenny had a row of them outside the kitchen window. One morning she noticed they had all bloomed overnight, fully open, facing the house. It had snowed the previous day. The ground was still frozen. Then the ivy began to crawl across the walls inside, not outside, despite no plant being kept indoors. Then came the birds. They arrived at dusk. Dozens of them perched on the garden fence watching, silent. And inside, the twins began to sing, not in any language Gwenny recognized, not in any melody she could place, but something in it made her cry without knowing why. She began sleeping with the lights on. She locked her bedroom door at night. She stopped inviting visitors, and still she told no one, because even in her growing fear, she could feel something else, something pulling at her mind in quiet moments, the sense that this was not possession, not evil, just something so deeply other that the human mind couldn't hold it without cracking. She first saw the symbol on March 31st. It was early morning. Mist hung low over the fields, the frost clinging to the kitchen window like cobwebs. Gwenny Thomas, who had begun journaling daily to steady her nerves, opened the twins' bedroom door at 7:14 a.m. As always, the room was quiet, too quiet. The twins sat cross-legged on the floor, facing the eastern wall. Between them, etched into the worn wooden boards in what appeared to be ash or soot, was that same figure-8 symbol. But this time it had changed. Beneath it, a new addition. What looked like a small circle flanked by radiating lines. A sun, a portal. No one knew. When asked where the drawing had come from, neither child responded. They simply stared at her in unison, unblinking. Later that day, Gunid fell down the cellar stairs. She claimed the floor shifted beneath her. By April, something had changed in the twins. Their behavior grew more ritualistic. They rose at precisely the same time each morning, 6:13 a.m. Even if woken earlier or later, they no longer answered questions. They no longer touched anything plastic or metal, even cutlery. Their drawings became more elaborate, covering entire sheets of paper with dense blocks of glyphs and loops. And they began speaking again, not just to each other, but into the open air, as if addressing someone invisible. Miriam Hughes, the teacher, continued to visit and record these sessions. In her third tape, now preserved at the National Sound Archive in Aberystwyth under restricted access, the twins are heard speaking for 11 uninterrupted minutes. The language, as analyzed by several linguists and sound technicians, contained recursive syntax, phrases nested within phrases in a way that suggested not only complex grammar but mathematical precision. One researcher noted that a spectrogram of the twins' speech closely resembled fractal patterns observed in quantum resonance experiments. Another, more controversially, claimed the voices could be played backward and still retain semantic shape, like two languages spiraling around each other. But it was what happened to Miriam that finally made the story too large to ignore. On April 12th, she was found collapsed on the floor of her flat, semi-conscious, dehydrated, and muttering the same phrase over and over in a language no one recognized. The doctors diagnosed a psychogenic fugue, a temporary dissociative state, but she never taught again. Her family said she began obsessively drawing circular diagrams and symbols in her sleep. One night, her mother claimed, she woke screaming, clutching her throat, whispering, "They're not speaking it, they're becoming it." Rumors spread. Some said the twins had been sent by the government. Others whispered of ancient beings, of portals beneath the hills, of bloodlines that should have ended long ago. But none of these stories made it into the local papers. The official line remained, two troubled children placed in temporary care pending full evaluation. Then came the night of the disappearance. April 30th, 1978, Beltane Eve. A night in the old traditions when the veil between worlds thinned, when fires were lit on the hilltops to keep the shadows at bay. In Cumrudlin the air was still, no wind, no stars. Gwyned's account of that night, recorded in an interview conducted 4 years before her death, is fragmented and difficult to parse. She had never spoken of it publicly. The audio is low and shaky, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I heard them singing," she says, "not like before. This was different. It was full." She claims she awoke at 3:33 a.m. to a sound not unlike humming but layered, like many voices folded into one. The house was cold, unnaturally cold, and the birds had returned, perching in silent rows on every windowsill. She went to the twins' room. The door was open. The bed was empty. But on the floor, written in fine black ash, was a full circle glyph. No longer just the figure 8, but a closed loop filled with interconnected spirals, and within it, a message in neat handwriting. "Why are waiting where language ends?" Gwyned collapsed. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks. The twins were never found. Police launched an extensive search. Every cave, ravine, and well within 5 miles was examined. Helicopters were brought in. Divers searched Lynn Braith. Not a single shred of evidence emerged. No footprints. No clothing. No remains. It was as if the earth had swallowed them. And then came the fire. 2 days after the disappearance, the head teacher's office at Cumrudlin Primary went up in flames. The fire began in the filing cabinet containing student records, including everything related to the twins. The fire brigade called it an unusual burn pattern, with only the one cabinet and a section of floor beneath it consumed. The rest of the office remained untouched. What little was salvaged from the fire, signed photos, was sealed in a box and eventually sent to the Dyfed, Powys Police Archive. That box vanished in 1982 during a department relocation. Years passed. The case was eventually marked as cold. Miriam Hughes withdrew from public life. Gwyned Thomas moved to a care facility in Carmarthen. The two twins became a local legend, a cautionary tale, something whispered around campfires. But not everyone forgot. In 1998, a postgraduate student from Bangor University named Ewan Eames published a controversial thesis connecting the two twins to obscure Welsh folklore, specifically the Plant Y Telwydd, or Children of the Fair Folk. Eames drew parallels between the twins' behavior and descriptions in 17th century accounts of changelings and mirror children. He also documented sightings. Beginning in the mid-80s, several hikers reported encountering two children near Lynn Braith, always at dusk, always silent. They were described as pale, barefoot, and perfectly still. When approached, the children would vanish. One sighting in 1992 was made by a forestry officer and recorded in the logbook, though the entry was removed days later. Eames' paper was ridiculed by the academic community. But in a locked drawer in the basement of the university library, I found something else, something that hadn't been published. A tape, labeled simply T2 of RCD. It was a segment of Miriam Hughes' original audio, but digitally processed to play backwards. The effect was subtle at first, strange harmonics, distorted vowels. But then something emerged, a phrase, repeated every 23 seconds. In clear, deliberate English, "We will speak the world into shape." I played it 3 times. The third time, the lights in my office flickered. I turned it off. I have never played it again. I returned to Cumrudlin in the summer of 2017. The village had changed little. A handful of new homes dotted the outskirts, but the core of the place, its stone cottages, narrow lanes, and ever-present silence, remained untouched. The old mine entrances had been sealed decades ago, yet the hills retained their hollow feeling, as if something still lived beneath them. I had come looking for answers, but in truth, I didn't expect to find any. What could be said, after all these years, that hadn't already been forgotten on purpose? And yet people remembered. They didn't speak the twins' names, not aloud, but they remembered the sounds, the drawings, the frost that came too early, the birds. I stayed in the same guest house where Gwyned Thomas had once worked as a cook in her youth. The owner, a retired school teacher named Alun Price, agreed to speak with me late one evening. We sat in his sitting room, surrounded by ticking clocks and fading photographs. He poured 2 fingers of Penderin into each glass and said, "They weren't born. Not like you or me. They happened." I asked him what he meant. He took a long sip and stared into the fire. "Some things don't come from here, but they come through here. The old land, it lets things in sometimes, especially when the seasons turn." He went on to describe a theory I hadn't heard before, not in folklore books, not in university papers. According to Alun, there were places in the landscape, ancient, unmapped, where language itself held weight, where words didn't just describe reality, they created it. The twins, he said, they weren't speaking. They were writing the world around them. Not with ink, with sound. I asked him if he thought they were human. He didn't answer, just shook his head. Later that night, I walked the edge of the Breckfa forest alone. The air was thick with midges. Dusk fell slow and heavy. I found nothing unusual, just trees and stone walls, moss-covered trails, a half-frozen pond. But when I turned to head back, I saw something on a fallen log near the path. A circle drawn in suit, 2 loops, one inside the other, and in the center a small eye-shaped glyph. I didn't touch it. I left that night, but I wasn't done. In 2019, I received a package at my office in Swansea. No return address. Inside, a faded photograph, a cassette tape, and a single sheet of paper with a typed message from the personal effects of Miriam Hughes. Found in attic, not catalogued. The photo showed the twins standing in front of Tydraw. The image was grainy, faded, but their expressions were unmistakable. Neutral knowing, their heads tilted inward, their hands clasped. The paperclip on the back of the photo had left a rust stain. The cassette was labeled, Session 7s and April 27th. It lasted just over 20 minutes. The first 10 were uneventful, ambient noise, some faint singing. But at the 11-minute mark, Ewan's voice became clear. He spoke in English. Language was born in silence, he said. It only became noise when we forgot how to listen. Ellie followed. We are remembering. Soon, so will you. Then, something strange. A third voice entered. Older male, faint but unmistakable. It didn't speak a known language. It didn't speak at all. It intoned. A single resonant chord, like a bell in slow motion. A sound that vibrated in my ribs even through low-quality tape. The recording ended with static. I didn't sleep that night. And in the morning, the photograph was gone. I searched my office, the hallway, the building. No sign. I checked the security tapes. Nothing. The package had never been logged. I began to feel watched, not followed, not threatened, observed, studied. And then, in June, I began to dream. Always the same. I stood at the edge of the Breckfa forest. The trees moved without wind. The birds sat silently. And the twins stood among the trunks, barefoot, staring with those obsidian eyes. They never spoke. But the forest did. It hummed. A resonance that filled the air and skin and bone. Words without voice. A language older than breath. The last time I had the dream, Ellie stepped forward and reached out her hand. Her mouth moved, and though no sound came, I understood her perfectly. She said, "It's almost time." I woke in a cold sweat. The clock read 3:33 am, exactly the time Gwenny had said they disappeared. I left Swansea 3 weeks later, moved inland, cut ties with the university. I've spent the past few years trying to forget, but forgetfulness is a kind of silence. And silence, I've come to understand, is where their language begins. They're not gone. Not really. They're somewhere on the other side of speech, where words no longer mean, but shape, where names are doors, and once you say them, truly say them, they open to what I still don't know. But I no longer believe the twins were lost. I believe they were called, and I believe we are next, because language doesn't die. It waits, it listens, and sometimes it speaks back.